The purpose of this short series of lectures, as I stated in the very first one, is to offer some kind of historical, intellectual, cultural background to many of the ways we intuitively think today. I want to reflect in this particular lecture on the influence of Friedrich Nietzsche, the great German philosopher. When we think about modern society, when we think about modern culture, numerous things perhaps come to mind. Our world is marked by rampant individualism, the emphasis upon individual rights, individual freedoms, the ability to be whoever we want to be. It's also marked by relativism, the idea that my view is no better, no worse than your view. There are no absolutes out there. There is a sense in which we can invent morality for ourselves. There's also a deep suspicion, is there not, of power. The idea that somehow those in power are out to manipulate us. Those who have power are seen as wicked. There's a sense in which the weak have become the heroes of history. And there's the notion that religion is not just false, but positively harmful. In fact, we met that idea in the work of Karl Marx in the very last lecture I gave in this series. Well, all of these things, rampant individualism, relativism, suspicion of power, the notion that religion is positively harmful, all of these things are anticipated in the writings of Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. His dates are 1844 to 1900, though he spent the last decade of his life in a state of permanent mental breakdown. Marginally in his own time, Nietzsche's ideas, along with those of Marx and Freud, who we'll meet in a later lecture, have shaped modern thinking in profound ways, and also, indeed, modern institutions. His ideas are pervasive and profound, and indeed, we might say, intuitive to many of us today. We take a whole lecture series to deal in any way adequately with the thought and the contribution of Friedrich Nietzsche, but I want to focus today on one particular aspect of his thinking that's of relevance to the overall narrative of this course, and that is his attack on religion, which perhaps surprisingly, given his status as a leading philosopher, was also an attack on the polite and sophisticated atheism that was espoused by many Enlightenment thinkers. Like Marx, Nietzsche was interested in the psychology of religion. And by that, what I mean is its social function, why it grips the imagination of so many people. He assumed, like Marx did, that the Enlightenment had successfully rendered traditional Christianity to be an impossible option for intelligent, thinking human beings. And that provided the background then to his assault on religion in his own day. It's worth noting, though, before we jump in to look at some of his ideas, that his writings are quite distinctive. For much of his life, he suffered from considerable ill health, and therefore a lot of his philosophy is written in aphoristic form, short, pithy, pungent paragraphs. He's also one of those philosophers who is very literary in his approach. There are philosophers who can be very tedious and dry to read. Well, Nietzsche's not one of those. He's a literary philosopher. He writes with a flair that makes his writings appeal even to those who are not professional philosophers. Much of his thinking is told in the form of stories and parables that make the reader sit back and think, that challenge us at the deepest level in terms of our own beliefs and commitments. And what I want to do today is focus on just two passages in one of his major books, The Gay Science. The Gay Science, or sometimes it's translated as The Joyful Knowledge. The Gay Science was published first in 1882 and then in 1887. And the two passages I've chosen both take us to the heart of Nietzsche's attack on religion and the challenge of a post-religious future. Like Marx, Nietzsche was not simply interested in dismissing and getting rid of religion. He wanted to raise the question of what that meant for human beings in what we might call a post-religious world. The first paragraph from this work is number 108. Reads as follows: The shadow of the Buddha. After Buddha was dead, his shadow was still shown for centuries in a cave, a tremendous, gruesome shadow. God is dead, but given the way of men, there may still be caves for thousands of years in which his shadow will be shown. And we still have to vanquish his shadow too. It's a piece of classic Nietzsche in many ways. The meaning is not immediately obvious. There's this idea that there is this cave. Buddha has died, but for some reason his shadow remains on the wall of the cave and terrifies those who come to visit it. And then Nietzsche moves on and says, God is dead, but his shadow remains. And the task of getting rid of that shadow rests on the shoulders of us. The point, if you like, is in some ways a relatively simple one. The influence of Buddha lived long after his own death. And the influence of Buddha, therefore, continued from Nietzsche's perspective to exert a dark and negative influence on human beings long after the Buddha himself had passed from this mortal coil. This paragraph sets the stage for Nietzsche's critique of religion. The point that Nietzsche wants to make is this: the Enlightenment, David Hume, Immanuel Kant and company, they may have got rid of God or reduced him to something that's very, very small and irrelevant. But the influence of God, specifically, as we shall see, the morality built upon the idea of God, persists and must be vanquished if man is to be truly free. This is why elsewhere in his writings, Nietzsche will refer to Immanuel Kant as the spider. He portrays the great Enlightenment philosopher as a spider sitting at the center of a metaphysical web that is used to justify Christian morality, even as he himself has got rid of the Christian God. The idea for Nietzsche is that's not enough. It's not enough to get rid of God. One has to get rid of everything that is built or has ever been built or founded upon the existence of God as well. Christianity may be unviable by Enlightenment standards. Well, everybody accepts that as far as Nietzsche is concerned. But they must take the next step and therefore get rid of everything that was built upon the Christian religion. Nietzsche is, if you like, calling the bluff of the Enlightenment, telling the great Enlightenment philosophers that they could not have their cake and eat it. They could not get rid of God and yet retain, if you like, the world that religion had made. For Nietzsche, the Enlightenment commitment to some form of metaphysics was but the residue of religion, a religion that had long ago lost its credibility. And that sets the stage for the second passage, a much longer passage that I want to read, the dramatic entry of Nietzsche's Madman. And I quote, "Have you not heard of that madman who lit a lantern in the bright morning stars, ran to the marketplace and cried incessantly, 'I seek God, I seek God'? As many of those who did not believe in God were standing around just then, he provoked much laughter. 'Has he got lost?' asked one. 'Did he lose his way like a child?' asked another. 'Or is he hiding? Is he afraid of us? Has he gone on a voyage, emigrated?' Thus they yelled and laughed. The madman jumped into their midst and pierced them with his eyes. 'Where is God?' he cried. 'I will tell you. We have killed him, you and I. All of us are his murderers. But how did we do this? How could we drink up the sea? Who gave us the sponge to wipe away the entire horizon? What were we doing when we unchained this earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually, backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? Are we not straying as through an infinite nothing? Do we not feel the breath of empty space? Has it not become colder? Is not night continually closing in on us? Do we not need to light lanterns in the morning? Do we hear nothing as yet of the noise of the grave diggers who are burying God? Do we smell nothing as yet of the divine decomposition? God's too decompose. God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderers of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives. Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement, what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? There has never been a greater deed, and whoever is born after us for the sake of this deed, he will belong to our higher history than all history hitherto. Here the madman fell silent and looked again at his listeners, and they too were silent and stared at him in astonishment. At last he threw his lantern on the ground, and it broke into pieces and went out. "I have come too early," he said. "My time is not yet. This tremendous event is still on its way, still wandering. It has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars requires time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and heard. This deed is still more distant from them than most distant stars, and yet they have done it themselves." It has been related further that on the same day the madman forced his way into several churches, and there struck up his Requiem Aeternam Deo. Led out and called to account, he said, always to have replied nothing but, "What after all are these churches now, if they are not the tombs and sepulchres of God?" I quote the passage at length because, as the Nietzsche scholar Stephen Williams comments, it's one of those passages that to make comment on almost domesticates it and reduces it. Nietzsche, I think, never wrote a finer or more expressive and powerful passage than that. But at the risk of domesticating it, it is worth us spending a few moments reflecting on what he claims in this passage. First, he claims that God and theism are finished. That point had been made by Hume. Kant, of course, saw God as important simply in his assumption, not as a knowable reality. But Nietzsche now demands that Enlightenment philosophers truly face up to what they have done. God is not simply the case that God does not exist. Enlightenment philosophy has killed him. Many know, second point, many know this, but few appreciate what it really means. Notice how he says at the beginning, as many of those who did not believe in God, the madman is after the atheists at this point, were standing around just then. "Has he got lost?" asked one, etc., etc. Notice, these are the men who deny God's existence, but don't understand the significance of what they have done. And yet Nietzsche, the next point one might say, draw from Nietzsche is this. This is of unimaginable significance. The death of God, the taking away of God, is of unimaginable significance. It demands that everything is changed. Nothing that was built on God. The idea that the world has meaning, the idea that there is such a thing as morality, none of these things can survive the death of God. Everything needs to be changed. And that leads, next point, to a tremendous sense of what we might describe as existential vertigo. The images Nietzsche uses are powerful, aren't they? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving? Away from all suns? Are we not plunging continually backward, sideward, forward, in all directions? Is there still any up or down? There's a feeling of existential vertigo that kicks in. What is stable anymore? What can be relied upon? Where is truth to be found? All of these things have gone with the killing of God. And Nietzsche demands that the polite Enlightenment atheists face the significance of what they have done. And that's terrifying. It's terrifying, isn't it? The madman says, how shall we comfort ourselves? The murderers of all murderers, those who have profaned the holiest, those who have committed a crime unimaginable in its significance and its implications. Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? And that takes us to an interesting ambiguity, I think, at the heart of Nietzsche's philosophy. Nietzsche's philosophy here is both triumphant and terrifying. There is the triumphant declaration of the triumph of the death of God, the triumph of the Enlightenment's polemic against traditional theism and Christianity, and yet an acknowledgement that that brings in its wake real terror. Is that not a characteristic in many ways of our own modern age? When you think about it, we want to be free. Everybody wants to be free to express ourselves and to be ourselves. And yet we also live in a world where, though we have greater potential for realizing that freedom than any previous generation, we see catastrophic levels of anxiety, even of teen suicide. All our affluence and all our technological power over our own destinies brings with it chilling responsibility. I sometimes in class I do this quite a lot. I ask my students to invent their own paper questions and answer them for the credit for the module. It's interesting that every year quite a number of the students find that uncomfortable. Here I am giving them the freedom to design a question that they can answer, and yet they would much rather not have that freedom and that responsibility. They'd much rather have the professor do it for them at that level. Nietzsche grasps something very profound in this passage, and that is freedom can be a very terrifying thing, as our current society and culture witnesses to. And yet Nietzsche is also in this passage pushing the fact that humanity must rise to the challenge. If God is dead, then human beings must become gods. What does he mean by that? They must invent themselves. There's no teleology now. There's no end, transcendent end for human beings as far as Nietzsche is concerned. There is no great sacred purpose in life beyond this for Nietzsche. We must invent our own meanings, he demands at this point. We have to invent our own worlds. We have to invent our own morals. The greatest human for Nietzsche is the one who transcends himself, who rises to that challenge, who creates himself and his own identity. In other words, going back to the language we used in the very first class, we might say that psychology and the expressive individual, these serve us as we make ourselves gods in our own life. We are those who are called to move beyond ourselves as far as Nietzsche is concerned and be whatever we want to be. Don't be what the crowd makes us. Be what we ourselves have decided to be. That's the challenge for Nietzsche of the death of God. No other philosopher, I think, understands the radical implications of atheism for the way we think about the world and the way we organize our lives, the way we understand ourselves to be, better than Friedrich Nietzsche. And that brings me latterly to this. Nietzsche himself set the stage for the rise of what we might call the modern expressive individual. Nietzsche set the stage for what we have all around us today, the idea that we can invent ourselves, just do it, be whatever we want to be. He set the stage for the man who I want to look at in the next class, who epitomized perhaps more than anything else Nietzsche's ideal of what a human being should be, the Irish playwright and poet Oscar Wilde. But as I said at the start of this class, Nietzsche was little thought of in his own day. His works did not sell well. He had struggled finding a publisher. Yet his ideas have come to permeate the way we think about the world in which we live. And in a strange way, Nietzsche himself almost seems to have prophesied this in one of the last books that he wrote before his final descent into total madness. It was an autobiography, Ecce Homo, Behold the Man. He wrote this in the months approaching his final breakdown. And this is what he said about his own significance, and it's with these words that I end. I know my fate. One day my name will be associated with the memory of something tremendous, a crisis without equal on earth, the most profound collision of conscience, a decision that was conjured up against everything that had been believed, demanded, and hallowed so far. I am no man, I am dynamite.